The year is 410 AD. It's been nearly 400 years since most of Britain was conquered by the Romans, yet the Roman Empire is a shadow of its former self, as constant infighting, corruption, and barbarian invasions weaken the empire. In order to secure the remaining territories that are left, the Western Roman Emperor Honorius has withdrawn Roman military support from the British Isle, leaving the native Britons to defend themselves from all manner of threats. And without the protection of Rome, the rich isle was a tempting treasure for many to conquer. The Caledonians and the Picts were no longer contained by the Antonine Wall or Hadrian's Wall, and were ready to swarm all over southern Britain. And from the raging seas, the mighty Saxons, a thorn in the side for the Romans for many years, now eyeing up southern Britain as their new home. The Romans had done a fantastic job of building up Britain with roads, sophisticated agriculture, deep mines, and beautifully constructed settlements. Yet the downside to all of this development was the native Britons had lost most of their former fighting culture. No more woad warriors, painted in blue dye, or deadly chariots to aid them. Some Britons did fight for the Romans, but compared to the Saxons who had spent most of their time fighting and raiding, the scales tip in the Saxons' favour. The first Germanic tribe to rise in southern Britain were the Jutes, who settled in modern-day Kent around the year 415 AD. Whether they came to conquer or simply settle by invitation is unknown. However, we do know they soon fought the natives and drove them out. Another tribe that was slowly pushing into southern Britain, the Picts, who came from the far north of Britain. As with no Romans patrolling the borders, the Picts could easily raid the rich Roman Britain towns. And by 443 AD, the situation for the Britons became so dire, they begged the Romans to aid them. But the Romans themselves were in no position to help anyone, so the Britons soon turned to another Germanic tribe known as the Angles. But again, the request for help was ignored, but by asking the Angles for help, the Britons unwittingly painted themselves a target. And before long, the Angles soon started to arrive and settle, seemingly peaceful at first, but in 477 AD, an Anglo-Saxon chief called Elia arrived at the shores of modern-day Sussex. With him were his 3 sons, and they soon began to pillage and raid the area, killing or driving out many Britons. The most brutal killing of the native Britons occurred at Pensavi, which at this point in history is a Roman fort. The Britons, hoping to take shelter there, were soon besieged and butchered by Elias's forces. Now with most of the natives either dead or having fled to either Wales or across the Channel to modern-day Brittany, Elia founded the Kingdom of West Saxons, later known as Sussex. The main irony in the rapid conquest of southeast Britain was the Roman-built roads enabled the Saxons to quickly traverse and conquer towns. The main issue with the Britons' lack of an organised defence was there really wasn't any main leader or commander to direct the defence efforts. But at the same time, the Saxons either returned home or consolidated their positions, just in case of a counterattack or a fear of stretching their holdings too thinly, without the numbers to man their new borders. However, by 490 AD, the Britons did have a leader to organise defence of what land they had left. His name was Ambrosius Aurelianus, or in English, Ambrose Aurelian. Ambrose hailed from a rich Roman family that settled in the former Roman Britain provinces, but soon with the arrival of the Saxons, his family was killed, leaving Ambrose to hate the Saxons and forming a resistance effort against them. Ambrose started to build his forces around the north of modern-day Wales and in part near Cornwall, as the Saxons had not ventured that far into southern Britain, This gave them the time to hone and build a coherent force, not only learning to fight hand to hand, but also to use the terrain to their advantage, as the area the Britons were now living in was mostly hilly and steep. Yet time was an asset to not just the Britons, but also the Saxons, as they were constantly moving more of their people into their newly acquired lands, and with this boost they soon began to branch further into Britain. In 516 AD, a large Saxon force around 2,000 to 3,000 strong began to march westward from Kent. Again, using the straight Roman roads to their advantage, they soon began to cover ground quickly, even for an army with no cavalry. The sources, however, don't tell us who is leading this army. The Saxons continued along this route for several miles without encountering any native Britons. Perhaps the Saxons thought that their terrible reputation or past encounters with the Britons scared any away, leaving their lands ripe for the Saxons to plunder or occupy. Whatever the case, the Saxon force was confident and felt no need to scout ahead. Ambrose's own forces, however, were preparing a trap for the Saxons. Now the location of the battle is disputed, with numerous locations claiming to be the site. However, judging from the sources, I believe the most likely place would be Baden village near Swindon. With the Saxons arriving near the village, they began marching along the bottom of the slope, and at this point Ambrose and his Britons staged their trap. Ambrose's trap relied heavily upon the use of a Roman cavalry unit that was also modelled off a unit at the Battle of Carhaix, called a cataphracts. The heavily armoured horsemen used to smash enemy lines. The Roman-British version may not have been as heavily armoured and well trained as their imperial counterparts, but they were still a force to be reckoned with, as the Saxons had no cavalry of their own. We don't have a definitive figure of the number of troops Ambrose and the Britons fielded, but we can make an educated estimate around 1,000 to 1,500 troops, with a good portion being cavalry. With the trap triggered, the Saxons marching along the ridge road were attacked from both of their flanks, the cataphracts dealing heavy damage to the surprised Saxons, but rather than stay and fight, the Britons soon broke off and retreated back towards their base, as the rear guard of the Saxons would have joined the fray, and the Britons wanted to avoid an extended encounter. Although the Saxons did sustain heavy casualties, they still moved along the road, whether driven by vengeance for what the Britons did, or perhaps feeling that this was the main Briton attack. But what the Saxons didn't know was this again was part of Ambrose's plan, as 5 miles north of the initial attack was a fort called Lidington Castle, a hill fort built between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. The Roman crossroad would eventually lead to this hill fort. It didn't take the Saxons long to reach, and upon arriving, the Britons greeted them with shouts of sword and shield from the high ground. The Saxons, however, were not deterred and formed their battle lines, and soon charged up the steep hill towards the Britons. Yet, running up a 900-foot hill with a sword, spear and or shield in hand would tire you out rather quickly. But yet again, Ambrose unleashed his most powerful weapon. The Briton cataphracts charged down the hill once the Saxons were halfway up, crashing into the Saxon line full force, dealing major casualties. But the Saxon line held for a while, until the Briton infantry joined the fray. and after a period of fighting, the Saxons fled the battlefield. But the Briton cavalry soon chased and cut down any fleeing Saxons. Few survived to tell the tale of Baden. This victory over the Saxons at Mount Badon was indeed a great victory for the native Britons, as for the next 50 years or so, the Saxon encroachment was halted. However, the native Britons would never rally to the standard they had at Baden again, and by the 7th century, most of southern Britain was under the control of several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. As for Ambrose, parts of his legacy and character would be used to create the tale of King Arthur by Geoffrey of Monmouth, as there is no mention of Ambrose after Baden, other than being described as one of the last Romans.